This is a response to Fede's video, no need to be here in the first place. You raised a lot of interesting points in your latest video, Fede, and I'll try and deal with them all, although again, you've condensed a lot, and I'm going to have to sort of maybe deal with them in several different videos, but first I'll deal with the one that's implicit in the title, that we have no need to be here in the first place. Now, I might agree with that, but that's an interesting point that you raise. And there's sort of an implication in there. I mentioned before that when you ask someone if they have the right to reproduce, the implication is A, that they require said right, and B, that anyone who is asking them or is sort of challenging that right to reproduce is actually doing so with any authority at all. If they actually do have the right to ask somebody else if they have the right to do something. For example, do I have the right to walk around in the streets here and ask people to see their identification? I don't have that right. Okay. I've dealt with that already in another video, but in this case, I think that the juxtaposition here is between needs and wants. Now, that's an interesting thing, and it depends on how you define your terminology. A need and a want. A need is something that you require. A need is a deficit, right? A need assumes that you're missing something, that you have to get it to sort of make yourself complete or put yourself in some sort of equilibrium. A want seems to be an enhancement of a pre-existing equilibrium. Like you want something, you don't need it, you want it. A want is an enhancement of an already sufficient position, whereas a need is you're trying to get to a position of sufficiency. Just there's a difference there. A need is implied to be meeting a deficit. A want is not a deficit at all. It is simply something that you want to enhance your present state, your present more or less satisfactory state. Or at least your more or less sufficient state, I'll put it that way. There's no deficits there. Now, that's interesting because, again, there's an assumption in there that in order for me to do something, I have to demonstrate that I need to do it. It's like the question of rights. First, my right to something may be challenged, hypothetically even. And again, I don't think that you're actually challenging me. I mean, we're just sort of playing with ideas here. But let's say, if you say, what right do you have to do X, that implies that you require a right to do X. Now we'll say, what need are you fulfilling to do X? You don't need to do that. Well, that assumes that a need is a requirement before you can do something, as opposed to simply a want. You're probably too young to remember this, although in a way, so am I. There was a TV show back in the 1960s called The Prisoner, which was made, I think, or also in the early 2000s, remade, about a British secret agent who resigned his position and was kidnapped soon afterwards and brought to this weird, modern, sort of surrealistic prison called The Village. And the whole premise of the series was, it was a short series that was it was like a mini-series, a longer mini-series. And it was assumed that, like, he was constantly being asked, why did you resign? Why did you resign? Why did you resign? Now, without really blowing the plot, his jailers were always trying to figure out why he quit his job as a top-level secret agent, like a James Bond kind of guy. And it's left up to the viewer, essentially, to decide why did the prisoner resign his position. I've concluded that he resigned because he wanted to, and his jailers simply couldn't come to terms with that. He simply wanted to do it. He was staking out his own action, his own sort of course of action as an individual, and he didn't owe any explanation to anybody because throughout, no matter what they did, he refused to answer. They put him through hell and he refused to answer the question, why did you resign? And you would sort of think, why is it so hard for you to answer that? It's very hard to answer a question when, I won't say it's hard to answer, but it's very presumptuous to ask that question. What gives you the right to ask me why I do something? What gives you the right to search for a need in what I do? There's a presumption there that I require a need before I can do something. When you say there's no need to be here in the first place, the implication, and don't let me misread you here, I just want to see if you agree with this. There's no need for us to be here in the first place. That is presented as an argument against doing something. Say in this case, procreating. It's the assumption is that we have to demonstrate a need. Now, I'm going to challenge that. Who says that we have to demonstrate a need before we can do something? What about simply a want? Well, wants are, in a certain sense, less morally justifiable, right? It's like in a court case. If I deliberately plan to murder somebody because I want their money, it's looked upon with much less circumspection or much less indulgence by the court than if I kill somebody in self-defense. I need to kill this person or they will kill me. Okay, then you might actually walk free in that circumstance. But I wanted somebody's money or I wanted something, so I killed somebody, then I'm in serious trouble. It's assumed that these two things are quite different. Something I'm compelled to do is not, quite as culpable as something that I wanted to do. Now, we seldom, if ever, challenge that. Or we seldom, or if ever, look into that dynamic there. Now, it's an interesting thing what happens when you actually examine the implications in this idea of wants being somehow less valid than needs. It's implied in that. I'm just going to read a passage from David Benatar's book, since that's what we're talking about here, where it's always implied. There's a real major implication. There's a major sort of undertone in everything that he says here. I'll just read it off my laptop here. Creating new people by having babies is so much a part of human life that it is rarely thought even to require justification. Need. In other words, he's going to sort of imply that maybe it does require a justification. Indeed, most people do not even think about whether they should or should not make a baby. They just make one. You see the implication in there, eh? In other words, procreation is usually the consequence of sex, rather than the result of a decision to bring people into existence. Now, how he knows that, I don't know, but again, the implication is there. You just want to do that. You're just not thinking of the consequences. Those who do indeed decide to have a child might do so for any number of reasons, but among these reasons cannot be the interest of the potential child. One can never have a child for that child's sake. All right. Think about what he just said there. He basically said anyone who has children is selfish. I can't read that any other way, but I am open to be corrected here. He's just saying that don't tell me that you need to do this, and don't tell me that you're doing this for the child. You're just doing it because you want to. All right. Let's just assume, for the sake of this discussion, that he's absolutely right. And why is it somehow less valid to do something because you want to do it than because you need to do it? Because you're harming something. That's why. So if you're going to harm something in self-defense or you're going to harm something in its own interest, then you've got to demonstrate, you can actually demonstrate why you did it. But again, who am I demonstrating that to? Is Benatar, is he setting himself up as my moral judge to say that, the activities that I engage in, he's able to make these kinds of judgments about me? He's doing that. If you've ever read Franz Kafka, especially Die Prozess, The Trial, it deals with something called Bateson's double bind theory, where there's an assumption of certain things and an expectation of certain things on one level of communication, on the meta-communication level, and then there are other things like obligations that are actually, or demands that are actually stated on you, where the one creates an impossible situation. It's a complex sort of thing that I don't think I can actually explain adequately in this one video. This might require another video. But the double bind theory is fascinating. And again, Kafka, in the trial, he deals extensively with that kind of thing, with the double bind, where you have obligations, but you also have these wants in your life. But every last want that you have is checked by the assumed obligations that you have. Now, these obligations are simply implied. The way that Benatar implies this in that particular quote, he's not actually saying that you have no right to do what you want to do. He's essentially just hinting at it, that, anyone who actually does, he's hinting at the idea that anyone who actually does have kids is almost certainly doing it for their own reasons. In other words, they just want to do it. They can't demonstrate a need to do it. They can't demonstrate a requirement that this happens. However, implicit in that is the idea that it is a requirement to demonstrate a need for something. You see what I'm saying? He's implying on a different level of communication that a need is required before you can do something. Now, who gave him the authority to say this? This is classical double bind stuff. He's sort of saying several different things on this, in kind of the same paragraph that I quoted, but he's coming at it from radically different angles. It's like the double bind theory is a sort of labyrinthine mind game that often takes place inside families, and I think that also takes place inside tight-knit religious communities as well, or tight-knit communities in general, where your position or your very humanity is sort of under scrutiny by the larger group that puts contradictory demands upon you, and ultimately what the group wants is for you to fall in line, regardless of, or the leader, I guess, of said group. Ultimately, the whole point is to put you in an impossible situation so that you are fully dependent upon either the larger society or an authority figure. That's double bind. Benatar is kind of denouncing people in that paragraph. He's implying that you have to demonstrate that you're reproducing, as it were, altruistically. He's saying you cannot reproduce altruistically, therefore you don't have the right to reproduce. Or he's making a case for this. Now, I would argue that what he's doing here is he's sort of attacking, as it were, utilitarianism without realizing it. Because he's like, we agree, say, in a utilitarian context, at least in, say, the way that it's being argued here, say, negative utilitarianism, that non-harming is the highest goal of a negative utilitarian context. He's sort of setting the stage for us without us realizing it, that that's what is necessary. He's playing kind of a game here. Now, or he's sort of engaging a strategy here. Now, again, I don't know what's going on inside of his head. He may actually not be aware that he's doing this. Again, double bind is a psychological thing, and it's sort of it's this hellish labyrinth that involves guilt, shame, obligation, all kinds of things. And what it essentially does is it weakens the individual's ability to assert him or herself, regardless of the circumstances, to make that person beholden to the group or beholden to the authority figure. That's what he's doing there. He's saying, you cannot reproduce altruistically, therefore you don't have the right to reproduce. But the problem is, of course, he slips that bit about there is an assumption in what he's saying that you need to demonstrate that you can reproduce altruistically. That classic Kafka stuff. If you just see the conversations, the dialogues that take place, say, in the trial or in the Metamorphosis. The Metamorphosis is good at this too, where he's constantly put in these emotionally or psychologically untenable or impossible or horribly stressful situations. Bateson, the guy who originated this theory of double bind, has said that it can actually result in what we now know as schizophrenia, this complete mental disconnect or series of complications that are enough to overload your normal thought processes and sort of almost drive you out of your mind, or actually drive you out of your mind, where you have contradictory or conflicting demands placed on you at different levels that you sincerely wish to seek because you sincerely wish to, say, A, fit into the group, or B, do what the leader or the authority figure is telling you what to do, because you've somehow gotten the idea into your head that A, society has your best interests at heart, or B, this authority figure has your best interests at heart. Benatar has set himself up in this paragraph and in everything that I've come across that he's written in this sort of authority figure position. He's sort of said, what I'm demonstrating here is that you can't do something altruistically, or if you can't do something altruistically, then you don't have the right to do it. Double bind. If you can demonstrate a need to do something, I get it, you're allowed to do that. If you just want to do it, you can't. That's not good enough. It's not good enough to say that you just want to do something. You have to demonstrate a need. Now, I'll ask him point blank, what makes you think that just because I want to do something, that's not good enough of an explanation for my own actions? That's not enough of a justification. Why did you do this act? Because I wanted to. Not good enough. Who is Benatar to say that that's not good enough? Who is anybody to say that that's not a good enough explanation? See, this is where the denunciation comes in. This quote that I just quoted is absolutely loaded with oblique and subliminal and subconscious denunciation. What that basically said is, breeder, you bad person, you breeder. That's what it says. That's exactly what he's saying here. Guilt. And not just guilt, but denunciation, scapegoating, saying that this is a bad person who would do this. As I say, this is the first time that I've raised this idea of the double bind in this, but it's an interesting sort of nightmarish situation that is put in. I'll leave a link to it below. But the double bind actually explains just about every argument that Benatar in particular puts into what he's saying. And also, there's a double bind that's implicit in Zapfe's The Last Messiah as well. It's that you've outgrown yourself, you've overdeveloped, it's alleged, and you can no longer actually be yourself. Because you've got desires that cannot possibly be met. Well, they can be met, but you see, the caveman, if you actually read about what his moment of existential horror is that kills him, it has to do with a double bind, a massive double bind, where it's just normal for him as a caveman to go out and kill things, bring them home, and cook them and eat them, animals. But he is met with, he suddenly realizes, he has also the capacity for empathy. We are contradictory things in many ways, and he's trying to reconcile the contradictory things, or he's not even trying to reconcile the contradictory things. He's somehow decided that the contradictions inherent in existence as a sentient organism or a sentient being it's necessary to actually reconcile them. It's necessary to overcome these contradictions. See, this is why I say that, the law of non-contradiction is hellish when you get right down to it, especially when you apply it to human beings. In order for me to do so, in order for me to be a human being, as per Zapfe, I have to do things that my morals might tell me are problematic, i.e. reproducing, killing other things, eating flesh, doing all this other stuff. Because I understand, I have empathy, I have the capacity to put myself in the other being's place. So he can't actually deal with that, so he combusts. And that's classic Bateson double bind stuff. The victim, I guess, of a double bind is attempting to sort of reconcile these aspects of his own nature or her own nature. In the Catholic context, you're taught to go forth and multiply, have 1 billion kids or whatever, overpopulate the planet, but don't enjoy sex. Now that's crazy. Now I know that they don't actually come out and say that in a lot of Catholic traditions. That's sort of that kind of part, that bit of it is completely overlooked. But in the more, I would call it repressive kind of Catholic traditions, that is very much an implication. It's the old thing about Catholics being somehow horribly opposed to masturbation. Like you're born with a libido, but God help you if you act on it. There's a double bind, right? You just want to do that. You don't need to do that. In fact, do you need to masturbate? Do you absolutely have to have an orgasm? Do you need to have sex without the reasons of, for the reason of procreation? This is, in my opinion, why the Catholic Church is against birth control. It's not because they want to control the population, is they want to keep their flock in a double bind. There are consequences if you have too many children, i.e. poverty, but you want to have too many children, or you don't want to have too many children, but your body is telling you that you want to have sex. Oh, you just want to have sex. You don't need to have sex. You just want to. Double bind. And again, it creates a neurosis. Classic Catholic repressive sexual guilt. So again, you have to understand that when you say that we don't have any need to be here in the first place, it's assumed that a need is a requirement. It assumes that I have to demonstrate a need before I can do something. Benatar is well on the way to abolishing, I guess we'd call it, utilitarianism or negative utilitarianism. Addendum has in many ways made guilt untenable. When you have to say, if you have to demonstrate a right to do something before you can do it, we're going to jettison rights because, we that's no longer a useful concept in our moral armor, I guess, or our moral arsenal. The concept of rights, because then you have to say that you have to demonstrate your rights. Okay, show me that you have the right to do anything. How do you demonstrate your right to breathe? You can't. Okay, now he's saying you have to demonstrate a need. Okay, now, if you look at that, if you sort of say, okay, I have to demonstrate a need to do something, especially if it's going to harm somebody else, then you're going to have to say, okay, negative utilitarianism is no longer a tenable position. Because it does not take into consideration wants. It doesn't take into consideration that which we want as opposed to that which we need. And the implication, again, through all of this is that wants are somehow less valid. I'll put it this way. Is it human to have wants? Not is it moral, not is it right. Is it in our nature to have wants as opposed to needs? Is it human to have a desire for self-enhancement? I'm not asking you to pass moral judgment on that or say, oh, that's just ego or whatever. What I'm asking is that a human, is that part of human nature? Is it, is having wants, desires, or the desire for simple enhancements, not meeting needs, but enhancing one's position vis-a-vis quality of life, is that part and parcel of being human? Benatar doesn't seem to address this. He just he's coming at it from a purely moral, more or less denunciatory, and as I would even say, a double bind kind of context. He's saying that your wants are not valid or less valid than your needs. I'm not even talking about validity. What I'm saying is it what we are as humans to have wants as opposed to needs? And what do we do with those wants? What do we do with that which we want to do? How do we deal with that? I think that I'm assuming that you're going to answer that yes, it is human for us to have wants. What do we do about those wants? How do we manage our wants? Benatar deals in guilt, shame, sandbagging, double bind, all that kind of thing. Okay. Is that satisfactory, or is that, as Bateson says in his double bind theory, that just results in madness and schizophrenia, or in Zapfi's case, death itself? Is Benatar just creating a pressure cooker inside of all of us? I think he might be.